We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end...
What will I become?
Senua's Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Underrated Movie Podcast. This is a podcast where we discuss films that are underrated, underappreciated, and ones that have just slipped under the radar and passed most people by. I am your host, Derek McDuff, and joining me today is Daniel Rubio of the Real Chums Podcast. I've had Marcel on a few times, but this is the first time having you on, so I'm really glad to get you on. How's it going, man?
Dude, it's going great. Thank you so much for inviting me, Derek. It's been a minute. We loved having you on the pod. Awesome that Marcel's been able to hop on and chat with you. And I'm excited to talk about Blackhat. And so, real quick, just some additional information about me. Like I said, I co-host Real Chums, another movie podcast. So if you love this podcast, you should check out our podcast as well. We do a lot of stuff on YouTube as well with some trailer reactions and other things. But I also production company, so I help people with their own podcast editing or YouTube productions of any kind. So if you're in that space and you're looking for any information, I'll be sure to give Derek my contact information. So if you want any help or to get started or whatnot, I'm here to do that.
Yeah, it'll be all in the show notes. Everybody make sure, hit him up, check the podcast out, all that good stuff. But yeah, like you said, we're here talking about Michael Mann's 2015 film Blackhat, starring Chris Hemsworth, Tang Wei, Viola Davis, and Wang Leehorn. And yeah, so it's a movie that came out, did not do very well at the box office or critically, and it's a movie that famously Michael Mann has kind of tinkered with over the years. We'll get into that, I'm sure. But you know, this is actually one of the harder ones to find Michael Mann's director's cut of this movie, and that's something we'll get into, because I think I was able to track down the director's cut, but I don't think you were, right? Is that correct, Daniel?
That's correct. So I purchased it. I was looking in, like, I purchased from Apple. I was trying to look to see if there was a director's cut in, like, some of the additional features. Sometimes they do like a commentary or whatever. I couldn't find anything, so I just ended up watching the movie. So, but I, I'm excited to talk maybe with you about some of the differences, as you share a case and just showcase some of the perspectives that I saw. I think this is maybe only the third or fourth time that I've seen this movie, and it had been a minute since I'd seen it. So I'm excited to deconstruct a little bit this movie and maybe touch on maybe why some of the hate.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and it's weird because this is like the only movie Michael Mann makes in like almost like a 20-year period almost, because I think before this is Miami Vice was his.
Yeah.
Oh it's I forgot there's Public Enemies, but still it comes out in 2009. He doesn't make this until 2015, and then he doesn't make another film until just a couple months ago, the end of last year. He comes out with Ferrari. So This is his only film in over a decade.
Did you see Ferrari?
I did. It was fine. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it.
We watched the trailer and Marcel and I were like, this looks great, but we don't review movies right away, just because of timing. But it looked like interesting. I think Michael Mann has always been a director that has been interesting to follow and interesting to watch movies. For the most part, I think I've always enjoyed Michael Mann's movies.
Mm-hmm.
I think they do take a couple watches to maybe fully love.
Right.
And I'm not gonna lie, this one I think is probably one of my not necessarily like my hated, but it's not my favorite Michael Mann movie.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that opinion.
Where do you land? I was wondering that with you.
Yeah, so I watched this one for the first time in anticipation for this miniseries, because I was watching a bunch of director's cuts supposedly there's like a better version of, like Doctor Sleep, which I already talked about on here, Dark City, because I had a couple that I was like, all right, well, I know what I'm going to be talking about. Like, I've got an Alien 3 episode already lined up. Kingdom of Heaven, got to talk about that for sure. But I was like, I got to fill out the series, got to find some other underrated, under the radar director's cuts. And so this is one of the ones I watched, and I watched it maybe about a couple months ago, and I thought this movie ripped. And yeah, maybe it's just because of that director's cut, but I really thought that it felt like exactly the kind of flavor that I want from a Michael Mann movie. Really, really great film. And yeah, so to kind of just touch on, this is a movie that he famously, right as it was about a couple weeks before it was going to come out, he moved a big set piece, the nuclear reactor scene, meltdown scene, it happens in the middle of the movie. He moved that to the front of the movie for the theatrical cut. And, there's a bunch of other smaller things that he tinkered with and did it, but the version I saw, I really highly enjoyed. What about the theatrical one? What did you think about it?
So because I do produce content, there was something about rewatching it, especially getting prepped for this episode, how much I noticed I felt editing at different parts that I think were like, oh, you know what? I do think that the director's cut probably is the better cut, because there are definitely, and I think, and it's probably only in that first hour that I think a lot of the edits that I felt like they're not necessarily jarring, but I definitely felt like something happened here. Either something was removed, or they reshuffled a couple things just to make it flow better, or whatever it might be. I think I definitely felt it, and so it has me wanting to get, like, I was bummed that it wasn't there, but overall I think the other thing, it could be that, like, with the cut, I felt like this movie, I think the biggest gripe that I have with it is that it felt at different times like it just slows down way too much to then give us the next phase of movement of the film. And
Okay.
I don't know if that's part of the cut, or if it's just the overall film of the way they decided to put this together. There's just so many, this time particularly, I just felt like there were so many moments where I'm like, oh, this feels like a slog trying to move this into the next phase. Even though every single time they moved into that next sort of section, it always felt great. I was always either rejuvenated me, it was like, surprised me. I forgot a couple scenes that were pretty great. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's just to help make the juxtaposition of those better. But in any case, that's kind of where I land.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting one, and I kind of wanted to dive into why I think this director's cut is different than a lot of the other ones that I talked about, or assembly cuts or whatever, because a lot of those ones are, the theatrical cut exists in the state it does because of studio interference, like David Fincher or Ridley Scott or whoever it might be was not able to put out the version of the film that they wanted to in theaters. But this is a case where, by all accounts, Michael Mann, did have final cut on this movie, and he felt like he needed to and maybe that kind of speaks to the pacing thing you're talking about. He felt like the movie started with just like a hacking, like the soy prices, and
Right.
he felt like, well, we need to have a big thing happen at the beginning, so we'll just move the reactor meltdown at the beginning, even though that doesn't really make sense. And there's a couple of things that get taken out. Like there's a scene I know in the director's cut where there's a boat that's trying to come into port, and it's got all the soy on it. They're like, you can't come in. You're like, oh, you're underinsured now. The prices that are on, like, you're insured for this amount of money, but like the soy is worth more than when you like departed. There's like a couple things like that I think it really does help. And I think it's interesting to see how Michael Mann over the years was like, all right, well, there's this movie that I made and it didn't really work. And he kind of tinkered with it. It's like, I'm going to put this scene back where it belongs, and put this scene in, put back this scene in. And it's had an interesting history where I guess that he did some showings of it, some live shows, or not live shows, but he did some like showings of like, here's my other cut in like New York and stuff like that. and eventually it ended up on FX, and now there's a version of it where like there's an Arrow video version, the boutique company Arrow, that put out a version that has his cut on it. And you could for a little while watch it on FX now, I think, but I think it is pretty difficult to find
Yeah.
his preferred cut.
Which I think it's odd that they wouldn't like that they made it so difficult. And again, this is one of those weird situations. Like studios are, it's always. I love that you're doing this series. I'm excited to go back and listen to some of these other episodes because I think there's as someone who cuts content, who works with and cut a couple of documentaries and worked on other projects, and I prefer editing over any other aspect of content production and filmmaking. The edit is something that I don't call it. Some people call it the last rewrite. But really, it's just the final craft. It's just, and there's so many ways of approaching it, and being able to create a cut, right? One individual who cuts may have a specific flow or characteristic, or the way they, the way they shot the film could be very robust. You think of what's his name? Who just directed Napoleon?
Ridley Scott. Yeah.
So Ridley Scott he's commonly known to film with multiple cameras just for like crazy amount of coverage, which means that there's so many options to choose from when it comes to cutting a film, right? It means that you can take multiple takes and have tons of options. You can do multiple takes a lot faster, but also have different options to cut to from different takes in order to craft that story that you're trying to get, which is really amazing. Whereas other filmmakers, like M. Night Shyamalan in Unbreakable, it's basically the storyboard is the cut. And so having a director who comes in and who's involved in the cut and may have a say compared to when studios come in and try to say like, oh no, this didn't test well or whatever, can always be really difficult. And to me, it's really, I'm bummed that this isn't more readily available, because I do think hearing from it, like I'm probably gonna try to go and find this cut so that I can get that comparison, because of the fact that I think every single time I've watched this, it's always been the theatrical cut and never been the director's cut.
Yeah, I had a real tough time even tracking down a version to watch. So yeah, I do think that there are some major differences, and I think you spoke really well to how important the cut is. People, and a lot of times they're called director's cuts, and directors are very involved, but it is a lot of times editors who are doing a lot of this work. And I think that if you look at for example, and I probably brought this up on the show before, but look at like Quentin Tarantino stuff and his movies that were made before 2010, I think feel like they flow a lot, the editing feels a lot quicker, more frenetic, whereas his movies post 2010 feel a lot more long and drawn out and stuff like that. And I think that's because his longtime editor, Sally Menke, passed away. And you can really feel how important an editor is with the tone of a movie. And so, go ahead.
No, I was just going to note that, like, editing, there's a reason why there's an Academy Award for it. And, I'm appreciative of that. And a lot of times, editing has a weird play when it comes to the story, right? And how people can perceive the story. And I think this one particularly, I think part of it is that this film is based around hacking. And I kind of have to think about if I were going to compare, like, what other movies that if we want to look at a movie that does things like this well, where it's a topic that it's hard to visualize because programming is not the most cinematic thing to film. Right. You're in front of a computer. There's a reason why in heist movies, it's always somebody behind some elaborate sort of location or whatever. Whereas this one tried to be a little bit more realistic. I appreciated that. I love that they had some sort of some CGI sort of like data effect scenes that to help us indicate that what is hacking and how small it is or unseen that it can be.
Right.
But when you look at it, I think of the movie or anything from the Great Short or Moneyball. These are both of those movies are movies that depict things
The Big Short.
Yeah, The Big Short. Sorry, The Big Short and Moneyball of movies that are talking about things that are not very sexy or anything like that.
Right.
But the editing helps to emphasize those stories, even more so with different cutting, different story perspectives and dialogue, and being able to help motivate that. Whereas I think that's where we're left a little bit. And I guess my question would be to you is like, do you feel like watching the director's cut, you felt that you knew where everything was happening in throughout this movie?
Yeah, I think so. There are some points when it is, a little hard to follow because there is a lot like, oh, like this person goes here. There's a lot of like jargon and stuff that gets thrown around, and like you said, it's not like hacking is not the most cinematic thing. And I think that's something that you see in movies a lot. Like when there are hackers, you'll have like two people typing on the keyboard at the same time, and or like I just watched that movie, not just watched it, but a couple months ago there was that movie The Beekeeper, and a big part of that is like they're these scammers and they're like in when they're hacking people, it's like these big LED screens, it's all bright and flashy, and this is not that at all. So there was points when I was just like, I really gotta kind of pay attention to what's going on, like when they're like at the end where
For sure.
right, she's got like her coffee, she's like, oh, I need to copy this, and they're stealing this, and they're like, okay, like we're gonna do the key logs and stuff like that. But I really appreciate how realistic that was, and it almost kind of made it that much scarier. It felt like I was kind of like watching this movie. I was like, do I need to like change everything I do about going online? Like, do I need to change all my passwords?
Listen, Jared,
Because
let me ask you a question.
yes, yes,
Do you have a password manager?
I don't.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you right now. Go get a freaking password manager.
Okay,
All right.
all right.
I'm not talking just the password manager that you get from Google. Okay. Like,
Yeah,
if anything, like Apple just released the password manager via Safari. You can
okay.
access that via like if you I use I'm a big Apple fan, so I have for a long time it was very difficult to like leverage iPhone passwords that they get saved via your iCloud anywhere else. But they released an extension that you can access your iCloud passwords in browsers, which is really nice. But if not, 1Password is great. LastPass is okay. Dashlane, MPass, I think is another one. There's tons of them out there. Like they make it really easy to change those passwords, and it's a little bit cumbersome because only to get set up. But once you get it set up, you shouldn't go. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with clients that I get access to their stuff, and it's like the same password for everything. And I'm like, you guys know if you guys get hacked, like the dark web has like LinkedIn has been hacked enough times that like your password's out there. Okay,
Yeah.
just your password. If you never, there's a great website called Have I Been Pwned or Have You Been Pwned.com, and you can put your email and it'll tell you every single data breach that your email has been part of. So highly recommend that you do get a password manager if you don't. I will say also reminding me how much that like people forget that this is this. Don't get me wrong. Like as much as I think I have my biggest gripes with it is the fact some of the pacing. If the director's cut really helps to alleviate some of that pacing and helps make that story a little bit more moving in like a good pacing wise, this movie is really a really smart movie. It's a smart movie in the theatrical release. I just think there's moments where there's too much gap between that next portion. And it kind of gives me early, like watching this again, it gives me early Extraction Liam Hemsworth or Chris Hemsworth, where like he's this interesting person that like is involved, and he could have really just an intriguing character. Same with Extraction, although less actiony, way more desk.
Yeah, but like you were saying, like all that stuff is so fascinating, interesting because it's just like somebody just presses a button, there's like, and it just like it's the smallest things, and even people who are like this guy, the Ethan Mapother character, he's like somebody who works in like security, and he gets tricked, like it's just kind of just like it makes you really realize like the world like we live in and how not only easy it is, but like how crazy things can get manipulated. Like somebody hacks him, and then he's like, okay, I'm gonna change the soy prices, and that like completely fucks up like the world economy and the stock market and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, I could press a button and then this nuclear reactor is gonna melt down,
Look, I don't want to like scare anything, but like there's a lot of things that have happened in the recent news cycle over the last little bit that has made me like I have friends that like who know some things, and like they can't confirm nor deny, but like there's a lot of things that like, hey, there's a lot of cyber attacks happening that we don't know about or that are not being communicated. It's not that to be scared of. It's not that they're trying to protect us, but at the end of the day, these things are so subtle. And like you said, like the guy of the NSA gets tricked because this hacker understands what it is, how to manipulate these individuals. And it is something that is, I think, despite the small like struggles in the in some of the moments, every time they have some of the action portions or some of the either whether that be actual action or the actual hacking or the research or of the investigation portion, it always feels really great at those moments in this film.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. I think I don't know, to me, I think some of the parts where I struggle is a little bit on some of the human interest stories, as well as, not that it was bad. Like, I actually really liked the chemistry between Chris Hemsworth and Wei Tang.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just think that like some of those scenes are like slightly too long, even though I know it's for the payoff for the brother dying.
Right. And which, by the way, you talk about good action scenes. That scene where first he dies and then you have Viola Davis, who, by the way, incredible in this. Both her and Holt McCann. Holt, I can never pronounce his last name. Holt McCanny die. That is such a incredible scene, and the way it just starts with that explosion, you're just kind of like, it's just kind of this softer scene, and then boom, it freaking hits you.
It's been a while. It 100% hits you. I think it's been a hot minute since a movie actually made me like jump.
Yeah, like I jumped too. I was like, oh, what?
And I think this is where I have a little bit of a dilemma with like with this like cut. I'm like, were they trying to like get these moments so that when these actual other moments happen, we feel them even more? I'm like, there's just so like that one specifically, I think is the best use of it. But there's so many other moments where like I'm like waiting. Come on, like let's cut to the next part, or like let's move forward. And so if the director's cut helps amend some of that, like I'm like, why do I have any other version?
Because I think the regular version is the one that's on Netflix and stuff like that. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's like I really wish that this cut was more widely available. I would hope that it has like a life like Blade Runner, how like now the real cut of Blade Runner, the quote unquote the definitive cut is the one without the voiceover and the happy ending and stuff like that. And that's something I talk about a lot in next week's episode, which I recorded, the availability of these cuts. And it's a shame that this one is behind all these paywalls, and sometimes you can't even like really find it at all unless you track down this really expensive DVD. But yeah, speaking of just kind of to go back a little bit to what we were talking about like all the cyber attacks and stuff like that, I think it really lines up with a lot of the stuff that Michael Mann has really returned to over and over and over again in his career, which is, a lot of his early movies are about bank robbers and stuff, and he's kind of someone it's interesting to see his transition to digital filmmaking and how the world's kind of changed around him. And you have something like Heat, which comes out in the 90s, or Thief, which comes out in the 80s, and there are these movies about like analog, for lack of a better term, crimes. But now he's like, in the world we live in now, the bank robbers are these guys. The bank robbers are the people who are just pressing buttons, and they're like, I'm gonna flood a valley and kill a bunch of people to like hike up the prices of tin or whatever. Like, like it's these dudes with like a neck beard and stuff like that who are just like manipulating everything. It's not, Robert De Niro like putting on a ski mask and going into a bank. That doesn't exist anymore. What exists now is these guys, and I love that Chris Hemsworth he feels like a really good protagonist to be going up against this guy, because he is a black hat hacker. But I love that he's like I never ripped off any people. It was always banks and stuff like that. He feels like a very, very Michael Mann-esque character, So I was a big fan of that. What did you think of all that?
So I love that you brought this up. I forget how much I like Michael Mann. I don't like when I think about but every single movie that I watch, just about every single movie of Michael Mann, I've always enjoyed, like thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think this Blackhat, like I said, I think Chris Hemsworth. This is early days Chris Hemsworth,
yeah.
and
He'd
yet,
been Thor for like a little while. Like I think
yeah. But
like
this is
2 movies maybe. Yeah.
yeah. But I think this is he was still testing all sorts of waters.
Mm.
And I think I really appreciate him in this one because like I said, I really do feel like Extraction is like him kind of revisiting himself in like a scenario like this, like Blackhat,
Mm-hmm.
because I think I see so many early elements of in this where he really wanted to give this character it's his due diligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I love the line where he's speaking, he's like talking about how I got to make my body and my mind stronger, and understanding the fact that like, and having this idea that like he's put himself in not only in he was in prison, but he was in a mental prison for himself, and what that means. And I think that like for this character, especially when we see the juxtaposition or we see the reveal of the actual Blackhat hacker who's doing it for the game,
Mm-hmm.
of just what he does, you know, like what he can do, like what is it like the one-upping, and like you said, like his motives was although he's a Blackhat hacker, he was doing it because there was an injustice for him. Like that's just something that was really important, right? Like, and I think I also want to circle back with the fact that like Viola Davis's character and the FBI team, as well as what's the Chinese
We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end...
What will I become? Senwa Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
Is Lee Horn Wang, I think is the actor's name, Captain Chen?
Yeah. So I think he's phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just think that like that team specifically does a really phenomenal job at being the FBI and trying that they're doing what they can, but also depicting like the struggles that they face. Which Michael Mann has always been really good at depicting each of the elements that are involved in the heist or whatever. Anyways, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think his team is really great. It's one of my favorite things about this movie is you have all these great, a lot of character actors and stuff like that in this movie as his team. I think Viola Davis absolutely kills it. She is so good. She's an actress that whenever she pops up in anything, I'm really excited to see her. I think she's incredible in this. I love that they give her the character. She never feels like a parody. She just feels like this. I don't know. She's just this like great, strong female black character in this like law enforcement job, and there's just enough like backstory about her that you understand why she is the way she is. Like you find out pretty late on in the movie that she lost her husband in 9/11, and that's why she is so dedicated to this kind of stopping these essentially cyber terrorist attacks. So I think she knocks it out of the park, and just her lying there dying and just like looking up at this tower as the world slowly fades out is one of my favorite scenes. It really is a perfect capper to that scene that starts with the explosion that just kind of ends with fading out. I already mentioned how good Holt is in this, as well as everyone else, but yeah, Chris Hemsworth, I think that he's one of the few real movie stars that we have of this generation, right? Like they did that thing a couple years back where or maybe it was like less than a year ago, where they looked at like what are the top, like they did a survey, they were like, what are like everyone's top movie stars? And I think he was like the only guy in the top 20 or 30 who was of this generation that wasn't a guy from like the 80s or 90s, like a Tom Cruise or a Denzel or something.
Yeah.
Like he's and because I feel like unlike, a lot of these other actors who have shown up in our new generation of action films, which are mostly superhero films, like they're names, you know who they are, but I feel like a lot of them haven't really broken away from their characters
Yeah.
in the way that he has. Like, if you see Chris Hemsworth in a movie, you're not necessarily, you might be like, that's Thor, but you're also like, that's Chris Hemsworth. Like, he is, and
Yeah.
which is interesting because he's the one guy who is from that original Marvel batch that is still in those movies. He had a Thor movie come out recently after all the other Chris's and Downey Jr. and everything all retired from the MCU. He's still doing it, but he's also can be like, hey, I'm gonna be like in Extraction. He's somebody who I think you can put him on the poster in a way that you can't with a lot of other people, and that's because I feel like he feels like one of these classic action stars where he's a really good actor, but he's also physically really good. Like, he is jacked and he is great, and he shows that off in this movie. There's like a scene where he's like taping himself up with the magazines and like the scarf and stuff, and you're like, damn man, you are fucking Thor. You're gonna fuck this guy up.
No, dude, the guy, that's something I've always really actually. I think in our podcast, there's been a couple times where like we want to see some of the other stuff that Chris Hemsworth, because he does such a great these action, like full on action movies, right? This one does. It's like when he's doing the hacking, and when he's in there, he's doing full force Chris Hemsworth way, right? Like he's in there, he's doing his thing. I love the bit with Viola Davis and Chris Hemsworth, and she's like, what did she say? He's like, you can call me.
Yo, because when he first meets him, he's like, yeah, he's like, how's it going, Chica? And she's like, Chica, am I Hispanic? And then and he's like, you can call me Chica anytime. Such a good line.
It's so. I think it was just a wonderful payoff. Like a little setup and a nice little payoff. But also, like you said, like Chris Hemsworth, he is an action movie star, but he's got lots of chops.
Yeah,
he's got lots of, and I just don't think we get enough of him right now in other stuff that like we just. But like you said, it's not like, oh, it's Thor. It's Chris Hemsworth. You know, and I'm excited to see. I'm always excited to see him in what he's doing next, because I think he's always doing something. Like every time I see him, I'm always pleasantly surprised by his performance and his physicality in the movies that he does.
Yeah, and I feel like I might even be repeating, because I was talking about a couple weeks ago Bad Times at the El Royale, and I might even have said some of the same things I said in that episode. So I apologize to my listeners if I'm repeating myself, but yeah, he just has such charisma, that like you're like, he walks into a room, you're like, oh, this guy, he's a star.
I think for me, one of my favorite things about Chris is how well he plays off of people. I think that him, with the captain and the female, in all scenarios, I was brought because of where he was taking the character. I feel like sometimes in a couple of, I think the best one of the scenarios that felt like there's a lot of charisma, like you said, is him trying to talk with his friend when his friend realizes that he's with his sister.
That's such a good scene.
It is. It really is a good scene. Like it makes you want to know more about their relationship prior to all of this. Even though like he busts him out, he's shared information and like pictures or letters or whatever with his sister. So there's some sort of there's a backstory there that we don't fully get.
Right. Yeah. Because like when they get together, him and the sister, it's just kind of, it feels like a little bit abrupt, but it's also just like, I get it. They're both incredibly attractive, and this is like the adrenaline's pumping. Like, I get it. And I love that the scene, when they're like, he's like, let's talk about this. The scene that precedes that, the reason they're talking about it is because all the alarm bells start to go off because all the transfers have just gone through. They've been tracking these three guys, waiting for them to deposit the money, and then it all goes off. And then, the brother runs into his room, and he's like, hey, I'm just gonna, wake up Chris Hemsworth here. And then he sees his sister in bed with him, and he's just like, oh, okay. And they have work to do. They don't have any time to talk about it. It's like, we gotta go. But he kind of, it's so subtle. It's such good acting. in that scene where you're like, oh man, like you can tell he's like, okay, well, we really don't have time to talk about this, but
Yeah.
this is something.
No, that I actually had to I had to take it back take it back a couple of times at that point because I just wanted to like I was like trying to process like what's really like just that moment of like his thought because like you said it a big moment, and I think this is probably where I think probably the director's cut even makes it better because the impact of what this moment is probably feels bigger.
Yeah, it is one of those scenes that I'm just like, whoa, wow, like, okay, things are really going down. He's got to do something, but like, there's clearly this is not the time or the place. But it's so because there's so many levels. It's like we've got to go, and he just clocks it, and you can just see it in his eyes that like, okay, I'm gonna have to deal with this. I can't deal with it right now, and then you get the payoff like a scene later.
Yeah,
So
well,
I
in the
think that's
helicopter,
really well done.
I want to know. I was like, is everyone else listening to this conversation?
They do. He does make a point. I don't know if they should. Like, he does make a point. Like he shows up. He like puts 4 fingers up. It's like go to channel 4, so we can basically have a private conversation.
So funny.
Yeah, but I think we were talking before about like all the really great scenes like that. There's some really great action stuff in that. Obviously, this being Michael Mann, he does gunfights better than anyone. There's that scene where they're chasing the crew out of like that safe house or whatever. And they're running through that big hallway and they're firing off the bullets and just like Heat with the sounds echoing. I'm sure, they probably did the same thing they did with Heat where instead of just using like inserting sounds like that, they used like the actual sound of like the clips being fired because it is just echoing. It is just going off. Like the sound design of this movie is phenomenal.
Yeah. No, that scene particularly, I think is probably that one. I don't know. That was another one I had to take back just because like I was like the with the guy who's they're chasing, and the explosion, right? That explosion also gets me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the scene I'm talking about, right? The one they're in that big like open industrial area.
They're like chasing him through this there's like they chase him kind of into like a dock or something like that, but like there's like a secret tunnel that they go through.
Yeah. Because I'm like that whole, like it is phenomenal. I find, and I think it's surprising. I'm like I think I wanted more at different times of this, but every single time these action sequences came on, they're phenomenal.
Right.
Like you said, like Michael Mann does like a shootout like no one else can, and I think I actually didn't know that he filmed he likes to film or to do the sound on site, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, because that was the big thing with Heat was that when they shot it originally they were putting in all these like sound effects, like gun sound effects, like you do in every movie, and then he was like, it just sounds better with like the echoing, and that movie is like one of the ones that was so visceral like that, and this had the same vibe. He's really smart about stuff like that. I mentioned before about him being smart about like digital filmmaking and stuff like that, and he there is a lot of that in Collateral and Miami Vice, and you kind of see the transition in that in Public Enemies. But this is the first film that he made that is all digital, where I think maybe he used a little bit of 35 millimeter. No, he didn't. Yeah, he used completely digital, which makes sense because this is a movie all about the digital age. So he's going to shoot this movie completely digitally, which kind of brings me to the end of this movie, which I think that last scene where the two of them are like he's facing off against the Blackhat hacker, and the way he beats him is basically by going super low tech, like by having prison, like basically clearly stuff that he learned in prison. Like, I'm going to take magazines myself. I'm going to wear a scarf. I'm going to have like a shiv like tucked in my coat and like basically just go out and like try and shank these guys. He's not, it's not some kind of like crazy cyber ending or whatever. He's like, the only way I'm going to take this guy down is by going as low tech as possible. What did you think about the ending?
So I actually always forget about the ending because of just everything, all the other like the shootouts and the hacking and whatnot. I appreciate the lo-fi tech. I like the the arrogance and like confidence that both of them bring to the end, this end kind of showdown. I don't know. There's something about it that like feels complementary to each other,
Mhm.
and
And that's what Mann always does. He always kind of has like a villain that is a reflection of the hero. There's that
yeah.
one scene that everybody loves to talk about, the diner scene in Heat. But yeah, this is I think another example. Like these guys are both black hat hackers.
Yeah, well, and they have the banter, right? Like,
Mhm.
well, you owe me, right? You use my code.
Yeah,
Like, and he's like, nah, you whatever, bro. I only made your stuff shine. Like, you could have never done this. Like this,
yeah. The wasted potential stuff that he throws out. I'm like, that's really interesting.
yeah. And so to me, like, I thought actually like I loved the preparation for that. I was like, again, the fact that the payoff on the scarf, I think is probably my favorite. The fact that like he puts this thing over his neck, and you're kind of like, yeah. And I love that you say, it's like, oh no, this is prison rules, okay, man. This guy's been through some stuff. You have to learn how to, how to go through it, and then just the final kill, like the very John Wick would be proud.
Yeah, he just shanks the shit out of that guy. He just
Exactly. He freaking yeah, and then the final just straight up in the head.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
no,
And
no. Go ahead.
I was just saying, and something else that's interesting too is like he does go really lo-fi, and they're also in that setting where they are. It's a very like traditional
Yeah,
ceremony. It's very like
yeah,
ancient. Like if people have these torches and stuff like that, which is like literally the earliest technology that we as humans have is fire. I mean, I guess maybe other than stone tools and stuff, but like it feels like really intentional of him being like, yeah, this finale is going to happen with tools and in a setting that is as opposite of everything else that we've seen so far.
yeah. I mean, part is like like they are people who, if there's any computers or cameras or anything electronical, they can manipulate. They
Hmm.
can. There's all sorts of stuff that they can do. They might be able to like set up in advance or whatever it might be to be able to gain quote unquote the upper hand. And so having that scenario where like there's they're out in the open, they're in the public, really does take them out of their comfort zones,
Hmm.
perhaps, especially for the Black Hat hacker. And yeah, I think it was a good ending that I enjoyed.
Hmm.
And I think this is the part that I think about Black Hat that I struggled the most with, is that, like, there's so many really great parts in it, and yet when I'm done, I'm always thinking about the things that like made it drag.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of these great moments, and I'm like, why don't I like this more? And I think it's part of it because when I think about it in whole, at so many times I'm like, all right, what's next?
Right. And I
What's
think
next?
that speaks, like you said, to the power of an edit, like things. And another one I'll bring up is the Spider-Man 3. There is an editor's cut, and I feel
Yes.
like have you seen the editor's cut of Spider-Man 3?
It's been a couple of years, but I have seen that one.
Yeah, that's another one that, and I've covered it, so I won't go too much into it. But that's another one where I feel like, just it's a lot of the same scenes. They don't change that much, but the way those scenes all flow together works so much better. And it's another one where, like, after the fact, after knowing what worked and what didn't work in the movie, they were able to go back in because yeah, this movie did not do well. Like we talked about how poorly it did critically. It
Yeah.
also like did really bad at the box office, like
Oh
to the
yeah.
point where like I mentioned that Michael Mann essentially got put in director jail. This was a movie with a $70 million budget. It didn't even break 20 at the box office, so it probably lost upwards of $100 million once you factor in marketing and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's rough. That's rough. It's a rough place to be in, especially with like hits with Heat. So many of these other movies that like he became known as, for like what he can do. That I
Yeah.
mean, that's I don't know what commentaries out there for Michael on his this time period for him, but definitely no bueno. I'm glad he's back on the horse, and he's been like really putting his back into it and giving us some really great gems. I think one thing that I I'm intrigued with this idea of the fact that you brought up all these director's cuts and whatnot. How much in the society, in the world that we live in, where I think of Zack Snyder, right?
Mm.
Michael Mann were to connect with the studio that was doing direct to digital, how often there would be an additional cut or version that would be released because he wanted to tell another version of it, and if that would, or if we will end up seeing more takes like this as as perhaps streaming evolves, because
Yeah.
it's easy to just upload a new version for a weekend or something,
Yeah, and that's I won't talk too much about it because I do go into it pretty in depth in another episode. But like I think that the availability of streaming has given a rise to these cuts, but because like in the 80s and 90s you wouldn't have a way at all to watch this cut.
Right.
But now like even you can put it on FX, you can buy a special version, you can download it or whatever. And I think a big part of that is because of people like Ridley Scott, but it's also because of people like George Lucas. And
Yeah.
I think that I got asked a question in next week's episode about which director's cut do I not love. I probably at the time should have said the Star Wars special editions because I do prefer, obviously, I think like most people do, I think the original ones. But George Lucas is always a technical innovator, and I think that his idea of like, hey, I'm going to put out these other cuts, these are my true versions of the movie, is something that really resonated with a lot of directors, and that's why part of the reason why we have seen so many of these cuts, and with the availability of streaming and all these other things, that's going to be more and more prevalent, I think, and even fan cuts, I think they're going to be more of a thing,
Oh, interesting. Fan cuts. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. I mean, there are YouTube channels that are dedicated to like fan cuts. I guess, Michael, have you been asked already? Should there be more director's cuts, or do you feel like that the cut that is released should be the cut that we hold with that lasts?
I like director's cuts, or I won't even say director's cuts because I think that puts too much of the that goes into the tour theory a little too much, and I think I'll say I like extended editions, alternate cuts, whether they be from directors or editors or whoever, fans. I do like getting alternative versions of movies because whether they be something that wasn't fully realized for whatever reason, or someone thinks like, oh, this could like this director wants to go back and it's like, I really should have put the nuclear reaction in the middle of the movie instead of at the beginning. It gives them a chance to kind of go back and fix things, and I think there's some examples. Like I said, the Star Wars special doesn't always work. I think that sometimes it can ruin the flow of a movie. Like I think the Apocalypse Now one is a little bit too long. There's a few other examples, but I think generally it gives a chance for these creators to go back and give the version that they wanted, and that's why these movies are underrated. I think a lot of times is because people don't see the version that should have been given to people for whatever reason.
Yeah. Okay. Sweet.
Yep. Well, any final thoughts on Blackhat here before we wrap up?
I think the only final thought would be I'd love to see Michael Mann try to revisit a film kind of like Blackhat again. I think that it would be really great. I would love to see, or maybe not great, but I would love to do another attempt at this style of heist or like of filmmaking challenge that still is even more relevant today than this was when it was released, and have him apply some of the things that he's learned over the years with digital and see what he can come up with and what he does.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only last thought that I had, I think, was that one thing I think this movie does really smartly is that I think that a big thing about hackers is they obviously have a lot of computer knowledge, but they also are really good at like reading people, and that's the whole thing is like they understand the way that humans will react when given a certain thing. It's like, okay, if I email him this, then he'll like send this back. What's the name of his bot, whatever. And I think Chris Hemsworth plays that so well, where he is a guy who just understands people. That's one of his best qualities. Like he's also like really smart, a really tough guy, but he's also able to just kind of like look at guys and like I love that he basically manipulates that whole scene at the end by being like, oh, I don't want to meet you. And he makes the guy, the main villain, be like, oh, I'm going to set this meeting up because he doesn't want to. He like manipulates that whole thing. So I think that the psychology in this movie is handled in a really intelligent way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in fact, I think that like this is why you need to do a rewatch of this film, and why. And I'm saying this to myself, right? I'm like speaking to myself of like something I've learned as I've been doing my podcast is how much sometimes we have to revisit a film, even though we may not have loved it, and it might take a couple watches. But there's a reason why films end up getting greenlit, and it may not be the most amazing film, but there are reasons. There are story little things that are in those films that make them great. And I mean, there's a few out there that you like have no hope, but
Right.
but I mean, overall, like you can, they take time to marinate. Like it takes time to marinate as a viewer. Like you have to mature, you learn and grow. It also it has to marinate in the sense of like understanding the film, the director, like where was Micheal Mann at? Understanding some of that portions, right? Being able to be smart in your watching. I think this is one of those ones I think that like I still have yet to get there, but I ultimately said that this movie has some really great parts. I think there's some of the parts that I think that cause me to wonder what's happening. But I'm gonna have to go out there and see if I can get that director's cut so I can give myself some better knowledge and see what he initially thought, rather than tweaking it for perhaps the masses.
Yeah, I am glad that we were able to be able to talk about both versions, because obviously that's the whole big point of this miniseries is that there's these other cuts and how are they different? Like, what's the point of a director's cut? All that stuff. So yeah, I think that's all very well put. With that, then I just have one more question for you. Do you have a favorite director's cut or alternative edition of a film?
Oh, good question. I don't think no. I would say no. I don't.
Okay.
Part of it for me is that I actually tend to enjoy. I'm actually an individual that I want people to think about what they're gonna like that cut and release it, because a lot of times directors, if there or a lot of times when they do a recut, it ends up being longer. I'm not. There's sometimes when longer is better, but usually I think that like there's a reason why the "cut your darlings" is a phrase in editing, and it's because sometimes that one little thing that you are cherishing and you think is going to be that really should be there, at the end of the day doesn't really matter, right? And so I think I'm an individual who I like to have films that I'll end up watching the theatrical cuts on most of them.
Okay,
And
that's fair.
see that. Yeah. I will.
Okay.
Well, I guess if I was going to choose one, I will say, and this is kind of contradictory, but it's only because I wanted more of it, is Zack Snyder's Justice League.
Okay.
And that's only because I wanted more of that world, and we never got it, and I feel robbed. So
yeah,
I cherish
that's an interesting case. Yeah, because that film kind of got taken away from him, and he was given a chance to kind of go back and redo it, which good for him. I'm glad that he got that opportunity. And another, I'll just throw out, because I've been asking this question to all my guests, and I've been trying to give some examples of some ones that I like that wouldn't be covered here on Underrated necessarily. And one of my favorite films of all time is Amadeus. The theatrical cut is an absolutely just incredible film, 5-star masterpiece. There's a reason it won all those Oscars, including Best Picture.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like the director's cut is even better. It's like this was perfect. This is even more perfect. Where because it gives a little bit more context to it still works and it still makes sense without that. But like certain characters' interactions and why they feel the way about each other that they do make a lot more sense with the director's cut. So that's one where I'm just like, after the fact, they're like, here's a director's cut, here's just some extra stuff for you. It makes the movie kind of even better. So I wanted to throw out Amadeus for anybody listening. So check out the director's cut of that one. Have you seen either version of Amadeus, by the way?
I've seen the theatrical cut, but I've not seen the director's cut. So I'll have to put that on my docket and probably watch it here in the next couple weeks.
Yeah, check it out. I mean, when you got 3 hours, cause the original's already pretty long, so it's even longer. But yeah, it's highly recommended for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Daniel, so much for coming on. This was a blast. One last time before we wrap up, where can people find you, find your podcast, find the stuff that you do before we close?
Yeah, you can find me at Real Chums is where you can find all of our podcast stuff and talking about on YouTube. We do our podcast there or wherever you get your podcasts. But we also do trailer reactions and some movie news once a week. For if you are somebody who's looking to get into podcasting or want some help in producing and not having to edit your podcasts, you can find me, Rubio, at swiftpeakproductions.com.
Very nice, very nice. And yeah, anybody out there, if you're listening for the first time because you're a big fan of Real Chums or Daniel, I'd love you to subscribe. Come back, listen to the next week's episode on Kingdom of Heaven is going to be the end of this miniseries. If you haven't listened to them, check out the first 2 episodes, Alien 3 and Dr. Sleep. Had a lot of fun with those. Got some more fun stuff planned this summer, but yeah. On all the podcast apps, of course, on all the social medias, just look up Underrated Movie Podcast there. There's also a Patreon, patreon.com/underrated movie podcast, where I do a bonus podcast once a month. I cover a sports film. This month is going to be... When is this coming out? I think this is going to be the racing film, whichever wins the poll there. So go check that out. All that stuff is on underratedmoviepodcast.com. Check out my other podcast that I do, the Midnight Film Society with my buddy Damien, where we talk about more recently released films. So yeah, got a lot of stuff, but one more time, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really glad we finally got you on here.
Thanks, Derek. It was a pleasure.
All right, see you guys all next time.